Clean that up right now, or I'll kick the shit out of you.
Like hell I will.
She held her hands like claws, ready to scratch his bare chest to ribbons. Carlo went back into the bedroom, and when he came out, he was holding his belt doubled in his hand.
Clean it up.
There was no mistaking the menace in his voice. She stood there, not moving, and he swung the belt against her heavily padded hips, the leather stinging, but not really hurting. Connie retreated to the kitchen cabinets, and her hand went into one of the drawers to haul out the long bread knife. She held it ready.
Even the female Corleones are murderers.
He put the belt down on the kitchen table and advanced toward her. She tried a sudden lunge, but her pregnant, heavy body made her slow, and he eluded the thrust she aimed at his groin in such deadly earnest. He disarmed her easily, and then he started to slap her face with a slow, medium-heavy stroke so as not to break the skin. He hit her again and again as she retreated around the kitchen table trying to escape him, and he pursued her into the bedroom. She tried to bite his hand, and he grabbed her by the hair to lift her head up. He slapped her face until she began to weep like a little girl with pain and humiliation. Then he threw her contemptuously onto the bed. He drank from the bottle of whiskey still on the night table. He seemed very drunk now. His light blue eyes had a crazy glint in them, and finally Connie was truly afraid. Carlos straddled his legs apart and drank from the bottle. He reached down and grabbed a chunk of her pregnant, heavy thigh in his hand. He squeezed very hard, hurting her and making her beg for mercy.
You're fat as a pig.
With disgust, he walked out of the bedroom. Thoroughly frightened and cowed, she lay in the bed, not daring to see what her husband was doing in the other room. Finally, she rose and went to the door to peer into the living room. Carlo had opened a fresh bottle of whiskey and was sprawled on the sofa. In a little while, he would drink himself into sodden sleep, and she could sneak into the kitchen and call her family in Long Beach. She would tell her mother to send someone out here to get her. She just hoped Sonny didn't answer the phone. She knew it would be best to talk to Tom Hagen or her mother. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night when the kitchen phone in Don Corleone's house rang. It was answered by one of the Don's bodyguards, who dutifully turned the phone over to Connie's mother. But Mrs. Corleone could hardly understand what her daughter was saying. The girl was hysterical, yet trying to whisper so that her husband in the next room would not hear her. Also, her face had become swollen because of the slaps, and her puffy lips thickened her speech. Mrs. Corleone made a sign to the bodyguard that he should call Sonny, who was in the living room with Tom Hagen. Sonny came into the kitchen and took the phone from his mother.
Yeah, Connie.
Connie was so frightened, both of her husband and of what her brother would do, that her speech became worse. She babbled,
Sonny, just send a car to bring me home. I'll tell you then. It's nothing, Sonny. Don't you come. Send Tom. Please, Sonny. It's nothing. I just want to come home.
By this time, Hagen had come into the room. The Don was already under a sedated sleep in the bedroom above, and Hagen wanted to keep an eye on Sonny in all crises. The two interior bodyguards were also in the kitchen. Everybody was watching Sonny as he listened on the phone. There was no question that the violence in Sonny Corleone's nature rose from some deep, mysterious, physical well. As they watched, they could actually see the blood rushing to his heavily corded neck, could see the eyes film with hatred, the separate features of his face tightening, growing pinched. Then his face took on the grayish hue of a sick man fighting off some sort of death, except that the adrenaline pumping through his body made his hands tremble. But his voice was controlled, pitched low, as he told his sister,
You wait there. You just wait there.
He hung up the phone. He stood there a moment, quite stunned with his own rage. Then he said,
The fucking son of a bitch. The fucking son of a bitch.
He ran out of the house. Hagen knew the look on Sonny's face. All reasoning power had left him. At this moment, Sonny was capable of anything. Hagen also knew that the ride into the city would cool Sonny off, make him more rational. But that rationality might make him even more dangerous, though the rationality would enable him to protect himself against the consequences of his rage. Hagen heard the car motor roaring into life, and he said to the two bodyguards,
Go after him.
Then he went to the phone and made some calls. He arranged for some men of Sonny's regime living in the city to go up to Carlo Rizzi's apartment and get Carlo out of there. Other men would stay with Connie until Sonny arrived. He was taking a chance, thwarting Sonny, but he knew that Don would back him up. He was afraid that Sonny might kill Carlo in front of witnesses. He did not expect trouble from the enemy. The five families had been quiet too long, and obviously were looking for peace of some kind. By the time Sonny roared out of the mall in his Buick, he had already regained, partly, his senses. He noted the two bodyguards getting into a car to follow him and approved. He expected no danger. The five families had quit counterattacking. were not really fighting anymore. He had grabbed his jacket in the foyer, and there was a gun in a secret dashboard compartment of the car registered in the name of a member of his regime, so that he, personally, could not get into any legal trouble. But he did not anticipate needing any weapon. He did not even know what he was going to do with Carlo Rizzi. Now that he had a chance to think, Sonny knew he could not kill the father of an unborn child, and that father his sister's husband, not over a domestic spat, except that it was not just a domestic spat. Carlo was a bad guy, and Sonny felt responsible that his sister had met the bastard through him. The paradox in Sonny's violent nature was that he could not hit a woman, and had never done so, that he could not harm a child or anything helpless. When Carlo had refused to fight back against him that day, it had kept Sonny from killing him. Complete submission disarmed his violence. As a boy, he had been truly tender-hearted. That he had become a murderer as a man was simply his destiny. But he would settle this thing once and for all, Sonny thought, as he headed the Buick toward the causeway that would take him over the water from Long Beach to the parkways on the other side of Jones Beach. He always used this route when he went to New York. There was less traffic. He decided he would send Connie home with the bodyguards, and then he would have a session with his brother-in-law. What would happen after that, he didn't know. If the bastard had really hurt Connie, he'd make a cripple out of the bastard. But the wind coming over the causeway, the salty freshness of the air, cooled his anger. He put the window down all the way. He had taken the Jones Beach causeway, as always, because it was usually deserted this time of night, at this time of year, and he could speed recklessly until he hit the parkways on the other side. And even there, traffic would be light. The release of driving very fast would help dissipate what he knew was a dangerous tension. He had already left his bodyguard's car far behind. The causeway was badly lit. There was not a single car. Far ahead, he saw the white cone of the manned toll booth. There were other toll booths beside it, but they were staffed only during the day, for heavier traffic. Sonny started braking the Buick, and at the same time searched his pockets for change. He had none. He reached for his wallet, flipped it open with one hand, and fingered out a bill. He came within the arcade of light, and he saw, to his mild surprise, a car in the toll booth slot blocking it, the driver obviously asking some sort of directions from the toll taker. Sonny honked his horn, and the other car obediently rolled through to let his car slide into the slot. Sonny handed the toll taker the dollar bill and waited for his change. He was in a hurry now to close the window. The Atlantic Ocean air had chilled the whole car. But the toll taker was fumbling with his change. The dumb son of a bitch actually dropped it. Head and body disappeared as the toll man stooped down in his booth to pick up the money. At that moment, Sonny noticed that the other car had not kept going, but had parked a few feet ahead, still blocking his way. At that same moment, his lateral vision caught sight of another man in the darkened toll booth to his right. But he did not have time to think about that, because two men came out of the car parked in front and walked toward him. The toll collector still had not appeared. And then, in the fraction of a second before anything actually happened, Santino Corleone knew he was a dead man. And in that moment, his mind was lucid, drained of all violence, as if the hidden fear, finally real and present, had purified him. Even so, his huge body, in a reflex for life, crashed against the Buick door, bursting its lock. The man in the darkened toll booth opened fire, and the shots caught Sonny Corleone in the head and neck as his massive frame spilled out of the car. The two men in front held up their guns now. The man in the darkened toll booth cut his fire, and Sonny's body sprawled on the asphalt with the legs still partly inside. The two men each fired shots into Sonny's body, then kicked him in the face to disfigure his features even more, to show a mark made by a more personal human power. Seconds afterward, all four men, the three actual assassins and the bogus toll collector, were in their car and speeding toward the Meadowbrook Parkway on the other side of Jones Beach. Their pursuit was blocked by Sonny's car and body in the toll gate slot, but when Sonny's bodyguards pulled up a few minutes later and saw his body lying there, they had no intention to pursue. They swung their car around in a huge arc and returned to Long Beach. At the first public phone off the causeway, one of them hopped out and called Tom Hagen. He was very curt and very brisk.
"Sonny's dead. They got him at the Jones Beach toll."
Hagen's voice was perfectly calm.
"Okay. Go to Clemenza's house and tell him to come here right away. He'll tell you what to do."
Hagen had taken the call in the kitchen, with Mama Corleone bustling around preparing a snack for the arrival of her daughter. He had kept his composure, and the old woman had not noticed anything amiss. Not that she could not have if she wanted to, but in her life with the Don, she had learned it was far wiser not to perceive. that if it was necessary to know something painful, it would be told to her soon enough. And if it was a pain that could be spared her, she could do without. She was quite content not to share the pain of her men. After all, did they share the pain of women? Impassively, she boiled her coffee and set the table with food. In her experience, pain and fear did not dull physical hunger. In her experience, the taking of food dulled pain. She would have been outraged if a doctor had tried to sedate her with a drug, but coffee and a crust of bread were another matter. She came, of course, from a more primitive culture. And so she let Tom Hagen escape to his corner conference room, and once in that room, Hagen began to tremble so violently he had to sit down with his legs squeezed together, his head hunched into his contracted shoulders, hands clasped together between his knees, as if he were praying to the devil. He was, he knew now, no fit consigliere for a family at war. He had been fooled, faked out by the 5 families and their seeming timidity. They had remained quiet, laying their terrible ambush. They had planned and waited, holding their bloody hands no matter what provocation they had been given. They had waited to land one terrible blow, and they had. Old Genco Abandando would never have fallen for it. He would have smelled a rat. He would have smoked them out, tripled his precautions. And through all this, Hagen felt his grief. Sonny had been his true brother, his savior, his hero when they had been boys together. Sonny had never been mean or bullying with him, had always treated him with affection, had taken him in his arms when Sollozzo had turned him loose. Sonny's joy at that reunion had been real. That he had grown up to be a cruel and violent and bloody man was, for Hagen, not relevant. He had walked out of the kitchen because he knew he could never tell Mama Corleone about her son's death. He had never thought of her as his mother as he thought of the Don as his father and Sonny as his brother. His affection for her was like his affection for Freddie and Michael and Connie. The affection for someone who has been kind but not loving. But he could not tell her. In a few short months, she had lost all her sons. Freddie exiled to Nevada, Michael hiding for his life in Sicily, and now Santino dead. Which of the 3 had she loved most of all? She had never shown. It was no more than a few minutes. Hagen got control of himself again and picked up the phone. He called Connie's number. It rang for a long time before Connie answered in a whisper. Hagen spoke to her gently.
Connie, this is Tom. Wake your husband up. I have to talk to him.
Tom, is Sonny coming here?
No, Sonny's not coming there. Don't worry about that. Just wake Carlo up and tell him it's very important I speak to him.
Tommy beat me up. I'm afraid he'll hurt me again if he knows I called home.
He won't. He'll talk to me and I'll straighten him out. Everything will be okay. Tell him it's very important, very, very important he come to the phone, okay?
It was almost 5 minutes before Carlo's voice came over the phone, a voice half slurred by whiskey and sleep. Hagen spoke sharply to make him alert.
Listen, Carlo, I'm going to tell you something very shocking. Now prepare yourself, because when I tell it to you, I want you to answer me very casually, as if it's less than it is. I told Connie it was important, so you have to give her a story. Tell her the family has decided to move you both to one of the houses in the mall and to give you a big job. That the Don has finally decided to give you a chance in the hope of making your home life better. You got that?
There was a hopeful note in Carlo's voice as he answered.
Yeah, okay.
In a few minutes, a couple of my men are going to knock on your door to take you away with them. Tell them I want them to call me first. Just tell them that. Don't say anything else. I'll instruct them to leave you there with Connie, okay?
Yeah, I got it.
His voice was excited. The tension in Hagen's voice seemed to have finally alerted him that the news coming up was going to be really important. Hagen gave it to him straight.
They killed Sonny tonight. Don't say anything. Connie called him while you were asleep and he was on his way over there. But I don't want her to know that. Even if she guesses it, I don't want her to know it for sure. She'll start thinking it's all her fault. Now, I want you to stay with her tonight and not tell her anything. I want you to make up with her. I want you to be the perfect, loving husband. And I want you to stay that way until she has her baby at least. Tomorrow morning, somebody, maybe you, maybe the Don, maybe her mother, will tell Connie that her brother got killed. And I want you by her side. Do me this favor, and I'll take care of you in the times to come. You got that?
Sure, Tom, sure. Listen, me and you always got along. I'm grateful, understand?
Yeah. Nobody will blame your fight with Connie for causing this. Don't worry about that. I'll take care of that.
He paused, and softly, encouragingly,
Go ahead now. Take care of Connie.
He broke the connection. He had learned never to make a threat. The Don had taught him that. But Carlo had gotten the message all right. He was a hair away from death. Hagen made another call to Tessio, telling him to come to the mall in Long Beach immediately. He didn't say why, and Tessio did not ask. Hagen sighed. Now would come the part he dreaded. He would have to waken the Don from his drugged slumber. He would have to tell the man he most loved in the world that he had failed him, that he had failed to guard his domain and the life of his eldest son. He would have to tell the Don everything was lost unless the sick man himself could enter the battle. For Hagen did not delude himself. Only the great Don himself could snatch even a stalemate from this terrible defeat. Hagen didn't even bother checking with Don Corleone's doctors. It would be to no purpose. No matter what the doctors ordered, even if they told him that the Don could not rise from his sickbed on pain of death, he must tell his adopted father and then follow him. And of course, there was no question about what the Don would do. The opinions of medical men were irrelevant now. Everything was irrelevant now. The Don must be told, and he must either take command or order Hagen to surrender the Corleone power to the 5 families. And yet, with all his heart, Hagen dreaded the next hour. He tried to prepare his own manner. He would have to be in all ways strict with his own guilt. To reproach himself would only add to the Don's burden. To show his own grief would only sharpen the grief of the Don. To point out his own shortcomings as a wartime consigliere would only make the Don reproach himself for his own bad judgment for picking such a man for such an important post. He must, Hagen knew, tell the news, present his analysis of what must be done to rectify the situation, and then keep silent. His reactions thereafter must be the reactions invited by his Don. If the Don wanted him to show guilt, he would show guilt. If the Don invited grief, he would lay bare his genuine sorrow. Hagen lifted his head at the sound of motors, cars rolling up onto the mall. The Capo Regime were arriving. He would brief them first, and then he would go up and wake Don Corleone. He got up and went to the liquor cabinet by the desk and took out a glass and bottle. He stood there for a moment so unnerved he could not pour the liquid from bottle to glass. Behind him he heard the door to the room close softly, and turning, he saw, fully dressed for the first time since he had been shot, Don Corleone. The Don walked across the room to his huge leather armchair and sat down. He walked a little stiffly. His clothes hung a little loosely on his frame. But to Hagen's eyes, he looked the same as always. It was almost as if by his will alone the Don had discarded all external evidence of his still weakened frame. His face was sternly set with all its old force and strength. He sat straight in the armchair. And he said to Hagen,
"Give me a drop of anisette."
Hagen switched bottles and poured them both a portion of the fiery, licorice-tasting alcohol. It was peasant, homemade stuff, much stronger than that sold in stores, the gift of an old friend who every year presented the Don with a small truckload.
My wife was weeping before she fell asleep. Outside my window I saw my Capo Regime coming to the house, and it is midnight. So, consigliere of mine, I think you should tell your Don what everyone knows.
I didn't tell Mama anything. I was about to come up and wake you and tell you the news myself. In another moment I would have come to waken you.
But you needed a drink first.
Yes.
You've had your drink. You can tell me now.
There was just the faintest hint of reproach for Hagen's weakness.
They shot Sonny on the causeway. He's dead.
Don Corleone blinked. For just the fraction of a second, the wall of his will disintegrated, and the draining of his physical strength was plain on his face. Then he recovered. He clasped his hands in front of him on top of the desk and looked directly into Hagen's eyes.
Tell me everything that happened.
He held up one of his hands.
No. Wait until Clemenza and Tessio arrive so you won't have to tell it all again.
It was only a few moments later that the 2 Capo Regime were escorted into the room by a bodyguard. They saw at once that the Don knew about his son's death because the Don stood up to receive them. They embraced him as old comrades were permitted to do. They all had a drink of anisette, which Hagen poured them before he told them the story of that night. Don Corleone asked only one question at the end.
Is it certain my son is dead?
Clemenza answered.
Yes. The bodyguards were of Santino's regime, but picked by me. I questioned him when they came to my house. They saw his body in the light of the toll house. He could not live with the wounds they saw. They placed their lives in forfeit for what they say.
Don Corleone accepted this final verdict without any sign of emotion, except for a few moments of silence. Then he said,
None of you are to concern yourselves with this affair. None of you are to commit any acts of vengeance. None of you are to make any inquiries to track down the murderers of my son without my express command. There will be no further acts of war against the 5 families without my express and personal wish. Our family will cease all business operations and cease to protect any of our business operations until after my son's funeral. Then, we will meet here again and decide what must be done. Tonight, we must do what we can for Santino. We must bury him as a Christian. I will have friends of mine arrange things with the police and all other proper authorities. Clemenza, you will remain with me at all times as my bodyguard, you and the men of your regime. Tessio, you will guard all other members of my family. Tom, I want you to call Amerigo Bonacera and tell him I will need his services at some time during this night. Wait for me at his establishment. It may be an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Do you all understand that?
The 3 men nodded.
Clemenza, get some men and cars and wait for me. I will be ready in a few minutes. Tom, you did well. In the morning I went Constanzia with her mother. Make arrangements for her and her husband to live in the mall. Have Sandra's friends, the women, go to her house to stay with her. My wife will go there also when I have spoken with her. My wife will tell her the misfortune, and the women will arrange for the church to say their masses and prayers for his soul.
The Don got up from his leather armchair. The other men rose with him, and Clemenza and Tessio embraced him again. Hagen held the door open for the Don, who paused to look at him for a moment. Then the Don put his hand on Hagen's cheek, embraced him quickly, and said in Italian,
You've been a good son. You comfort me.
Telling Hagen that he had acted properly in this terrible time. The Don went up to his bedroom to speak to his wife. It was then that Hagen made the call to Amerigo Bonacera for the undertaker to redeem the favor he owed to the Corleones. Book 5, Chapter 20. The death of Santino Corleone sent shock waves through the underworld of the nation, and when it became known that Don Corleone had risen from his sickbed to take charge of the family affairs, when spies at the funeral reported that the Don seemed to be fully recovered, the heads of the 5 families made frantic efforts to prepare a defense against the bloody retaliatory war that was sure to follow. Nobody made the mistake of assuming that Don Corleone could be held cheaply because of his past misfortunes. He was a man who had made only a few mistakes in his career and had learned from every one of them. Only Hagen guessed the Don's real intentions and was not surprised when emissaries were sent to the 5 families to propose a peace. Not only to propose a peace, but a meeting of all the families in the city and with invitations to families all over the United States to attend. Since the New York families were the most powerful in the country, it was understood that their welfare affected the welfare of the country as a whole. At first, there were suspicions. Was Don Corleone preparing a trap? Was he trying to throw his enemies off their guard? Was he attempting to prepare a wholesale massacre to avenge his son? But Don Corleone soon made it clear he was sincere. Not only did he involve all the families in the country in this meeting, but made no move to put his own people on a war footing or to enlist allies. And then he took the final, irrevocable step that established the authenticity of these intentions and assured the safety of the Grand Council to be assembled. He called on the services of the Boccicchio family. The Boccicchio family was unique in that, once a particularly ferocious branch of the mafia in Sicily, it had become an instrument of peace in America. Once a group of men who earned their living by a savage determination, they now earned their living in what perhaps could be called a saintly fashion. The Boccicchio's one asset was a closely knit structure of blood relationships, a family loyalty, severe even for a society where family loyalty came before loyalty to a wife. The Boccicchio family, extending out to third cousins, had once numbered nearly 200 when they ruled the particular economy of a small section of southern Sicily. The income for the entire family then came from 4 or 5 flour mills, by no means owned communally, but assuring labor and bread and a minimal security for all family members. This was enough, with intermarriages, for them to present a common front against their enemies. No competing mill, no dam that would create a water supply to their competitors or ruin their own selling of water was allowed to be built in their corner of Sicily. A powerful land-owning baron once tried to erect his own mill, strictly for his personal use. The mill was burned down. He called on the carabinieri and higher authorities, who arrested 3 of the Boccicchio family. Even before the trial, The manor house of the Baron was torched. The indictment and accusations were withdrawn. A few months later, one of the highest functionaries in the Italian government arrived in Sicily and tried to solve the chronic water shortage of that island by proposing a huge dam. Engineers arrived from Rome to do surveys while watched by grim natives, members of the Boccicchio clan. Police flooded the area, housed in a specially built barracks. It looked like nothing could stop the dam from being built, and supplies and equipment had actually been unloaded in Palermo. That was as far as they got. The Boccicchios had contacted fellow mafia chiefs and extracted agreements for their aid. The heavy equipment was sabotaged, the lighter equipment stolen. Mafia deputies in the Italian parliament launched a bureaucratic counterattack against the planners. This went on for several years, and in that time, Mussolini came to power. The dictator decreed that the dam must be built. It was not. The dictator had known that the mafia would be a threat to his regime, forming what amounted to a separate authority from his own. He gave full powers to a high police official who promptly solved the problem by throwing everybody into jail or deporting them to penal work islands. In a few short years, he had broken the power of the mafia simply by arbitrarily arresting anyone even suspected of being a mafioso, and so also brought ruin to a great many innocent families. The Boccicchios had been rash enough to resort to force against this unlimited power. Half of the men were killed in armed combat, the other half deported to penal island colonies. There were only a handful left when arrangements were made for them to emigrate to America via the clandestine underground route of jumping ship through Canada. There were almost 20 immigrants, and they settled in a small town not far from New York City in the Hudson Valley, where, by starting at the very bottom, they worked their way up to owning a garbage hauling firm and their own trucks. They became prosperous because they had no competition. They had no competition because competitors found their trucks burned and sabotaged. One persistent fellow who undercut prices was found buried in the garbage he had picked up during the day, smothered to death. But as the men married to Sicilian girls, needless to say, children came, and the garbage business, though providing a living, was not really enough to pay for the finer things America had to offer. And so, as a diversification, the Boccicchio family became negotiators and hostages in the peace efforts of warring mafia families. A strain of stupidity ran through the Boccicchio clan, or perhaps they were just primitive. In any case, they recognized their limitations and knew they could not compete with other mafia families in the struggle to organize and control more sophisticated business structures like prostitution, gambling, dope, and public fraud. They were straight-from-the-shoulder people who could offer a gift to an ordinary patrolman but did not know how to approach a political bagman. They had only two assets, their honor and their ferocity. And Boccicchio never lied, never committed an act of treachery. Such behavior was too complicated. Also, a Boccicchio never forgot an injury and never left it unavenged, no matter what the cost. And so, by accident, they stumbled into what would prove to be their most lucrative profession. When warring families wanted to make peace and arrange a parley, the Boccicchio clan was contacted. The head of the clan would handle the initial negotiations and arrange for the necessary hostages. For instance, when Michael had gone to meet Sollazzo, a Boccicchio had been left with the Corleone family as surety for Michael's safety, the service paid for by Sollazzo. If Michael were killed by Sollazzo, then the Boccicchio male hostage held by the Corleone family would be killed by the Corleones. In this case, the Boccicchios would take their vengeance on Sollazzo as the cause of their clansman's death. Since the Boccicchios were so primitive, they never let anything, any kind of punishment, stand in their way of vengeance. They would give up their own lives, and there was no protection against them if they were betrayed. A Boccicchio hostage was gilt-edged insurance. And so now, when Don Corleone employed the Boccicchios as negotiators and arranged for them to supply hostages for all the families to come to the peace meeting, there could be no question as to his sincerity. There could be no question of treachery. The meeting would be safe as a wedding. Hostages given, the meeting took place in the directors' conference room of a small commercial bank whose president was indebted to Don Corleone, and indeed some of whose stock belonged to Don Corleone, though it was in the president's name. The president always treasured that moment when he had offered to give Don Corleone a written document proving his ownership of the shares to preclude any treachery. Don Corleone had been horrified. He told the president,
"I would trust you with my whole fortune. I would trust you with my life and the welfare of my children. It is inconceivable to me that you would ever trick me or otherwise betray me. My whole world, all my faith in my judgment of human character would collapse. Of course, I have my own written record so that if something should happen to me, my heirs would know that you hold something in trust for them. But I know that even if I were not here in this world to guard the interests of my children, You would be faithful to their needs.
The president of the bank, though not Sicilian, was a man of tender sensibilities. He understood the Don perfectly. Now, the Godfather's request was the president's command, and so, on a Saturday afternoon, the executive suite of the bank, the conference room with its deep leather chairs, its absolute privacy, was made available to the families. Security at the bank was taken over by a small army of hand-picked men wearing bank guard uniforms. At 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, the conference room began to fill up. Besides the 5 families of New York, there were representatives from 10 other families across the country, with the exception of Chicago, that black sheep of their world. They had given up trying to civilize Chicago, and they saw no point in including those mad dogs in this important conference. A bar had been set up and a small buffet. Each representative of the conference had been allowed 1 aide. Most of the Dons had brought their consiglieres as aides, so there were comparatively few young men in the room. Tom Hagen was one of those young men, and the only one who was not Sicilian. He was an object of curiosity, a freak. Hagen knew his manners. He did not speak, he did not smile. He waited on his boss, Don Corleone, with all the respect of a favorite earl waiting on his king, bringing him a cold drink, lighting his cigar, positioning his ashtray, with respect but no obsequiousness. Hagen was the only one in that room who knew the identity of the portraits hanging on the dark paneled walls. They were mostly portraits of fabulous financial figures done in rich oils. One was of Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton. Hagen could not help thinking that Hamilton might have approved of this peace meeting being held in a banking institution. Nothing was more calming, more conducive to pure reason than the atmosphere of money. The arrival time had been staggered for between 9:30 to 10 a.m. Don Corleone, in a sense the host, since he had initiated the peace talks, had been the first to arrive. One of his many virtues was punctuality. The next to arrive was Carlo Tramonte, who had made the southern part of the United States his territory. He was an impressively handsome, middle-aged man, tall for a Sicilian, with a very deep sunburn, exquisitely tailored and barbered. He did not look Italian. He looked more like one of those pictures in the magazines of millionaire fishermen lolling on their yachts. The Tramonte family earned its livelihood from gambling, and no one meeting their Don would ever guess with what ferocity he had won his empire. Emigrating from Sicily as a small boy, he had settled in Florida and grown to manhood there, employed by the American syndicate of southern small-town politicians who controlled gambling. These were very tough men, backed up by very tough police officials, and they never suspected that they could be overthrown by such a greenhorn immigrant. They were unprepared for his ferocity and could not match it, simply because the rewards being fought over were not, to their minds, worth so much bloodshed. Tramonte won over the police with bigger shares of the gross. He exterminated those redneck hooligans who ran their operation with such a complete lack of imagination. It was Tramonte who opened ties with Cuba and the Batista regime and eventually poured money into the pleasure resorts of Havana gambling houses, whorehouses, to lure gamblers from the American mainland. Tramonte was now a millionaire many times over and owned one of the most luxurious hotels in Miami Beach. When he came into the conference room, followed by his aide, an equally sunburned consigliere, Tramonte embraced Don Corleone, made a face of sympathy to show he sorrowed for the dead son. Other Dons were arriving. They all knew each other. They had met over the years, either socially or when in the pursuit of their businesses. They had always showed each other professional courtesies, and in their younger, leaner days had done each other little services. The second Don to arrive was Joseph Zaluki from Detroit. The Zaluki family, under appropriate disguises and covers, owned one of the horse racing tracks in the Detroit area. They also owned a good part of the gambling. Zaluki was a moon-faced, amiable-looking man who lived in a $100,000 house in the fashionable Grosse Pointe section of Detroit. One of his sons had married into an old, well-known American family. Zaluki, like Don Corleone, was sophisticated. Detroit had the lowest incidence of physical violence of any of the cities controlled by the families. There had been only 2 executions in the last 3 years in that city. He disapproved of traffic in drugs. Zaluki had brought his consigliere with him, and both men came to Don Corleone to embrace him. Zaluki had a booming American voice with only the slightest trace of an accent. He was conservatively dressed, very businessman, and with a hearty goodwill to match. He said to Don Corleone,
"Only your voice could have brought me here."
Don Corleone bowed his head in thanks. He could count on Zaluki for support. The next 2 Dons to arrive were from the West Coast, motoring from there in the same car, since they worked together closely in any case. They were Frank Falcone and Anthony Molinari, and both were younger than any of the other men who would come to the meeting, in their early 40s. They were dressed a little more informally than the others. There was a touch of Hollywood in their style, and they were a little more friendly than necessary. Frank Falcone controlled the movie unions and the gambling at the studios, plus a complex of pipeline prostitution that supplied girls to the whorehouses of the states in the far west. It was not in the realm of possibility for any Don to become showbiz, but Falcone had just a touch. His fellow Dons distrusted him accordingly. Anthony Molinari controlled the waterfronts of San Francisco and was preeminent in the empire of sports gambling. He came of Italian fisherman stock and owned the best San Francisco seafood restaurant, in which he took such pride that the legend had it he lost money on the enterprise by giving too good value for the prices charged. He had the impassive face of the professional gambler, and it was known that he also had something to do with dope smuggling over the Mexican border and from the ships plying the lanes of the Oriental Oceans. Their aides were young, powerfully built men, obviously not counselors, but bodyguards, though they would not dare to carry arms to this meeting. It was general knowledge that these bodyguards knew karate, a fact that amused the other Dons but did not alarm them in the slightest, no more than if the California Dons had come wearing amulets blessed by the Pope, though it must be noted that some of these men were religious and believed in God. Next arrived the representative from the family in Boston. This was the only Don who did not have the respect of his fellows. He was known as a man who did not do right by his people, who cheated them unmercifully. This could be forgiven. Each man measures his own greed. What could not be forgiven was that he could not keep order in his empire. The Boston area had too many murders, too many petty wars for power, too many unsupported freelance activities. It flouted the law too brazenly. If the Chicago Mafia were savages, then the Boston people were gavunes, or uncouth louts, ruffians. The Boston Don's name was Dominic Panza. He was short, squat. As one Don put it, he looked like a thief. The Cleveland Syndicate, perhaps the most powerful of the strictly gambling operations in the United States, was represented by a sensitive-looking elderly man with gaunt features and snow-white hair. He was known, of course, not to his face, as the Jew, because he had surrounded himself with Jewish assistants rather than Sicilians. It was even rumored that he would have named a Jew as his consigliere if he had dared. In any case, as Don Corleone's family was known as the Irish Gang because of Hagen's membership, so Don Vincent Forlenza's family was known as the Jewish family, with somewhat more accuracy. But he ran an extremely efficient organization, and he was not known ever to have fainted at the sight of blood, despite his sensitive features. He ruled with an iron hand in a velvet political glove. The representatives of the 5 families of New York were the last to arrive, and Tom Hagen was struck by how much more imposing, impressive these 5 men were than the out-of-towners, the Hicks. For one thing, the 5 New York Dons were in the old Sicilian tradition. They were men with a belly, meaning figuratively power and courage, and literally physical flesh, as if the two went together, as indeed they seem to have done in Sicily. The 5 New York Dons were stout, corpulent men with massive leonine heads, features on a large scale, fleshy, imperial noses, thick mouths, heavy, folded cheeks. They were not too well tailored or barbered. They had the look of no-nonsense, busy men without vanity. There was Anthony Strachey, who controlled the New Jersey area and the shipping on the west side docks of Manhattan. He ran the gambling in Jersey and was very strong with the Democratic political machine. He had a fleet of freight-hauling trucks that made him a fortune primarily because his trucks could travel with a heavy overload and not be stopped and fined by highway weight inspectors. These trucks helped ruin the highways, and then his road-building firm, with lucrative state contracts, repaired the damage wrought. It was the kind of operation that would warm any man's heart, business of itself, creating more business. Strachey, too, was old-fashioned and never dealt in prostitution. But because his business was on the waterfront, it was impossible for him not to be involved in the drug smuggling traffic. Of the 5 New York families opposing the Corleones, his was the least powerful, but the most well-disposed. The family that controlled Upper New York State, that arranged smuggling of Italian immigrants from Canada, all upstate gambling, and exercised veto power on state licensing of racing tracks, was headed by Attilio Cuneo. This was a completely disarming man with the face of a jolly, round peasant baker, whose legitimate activity was one of the big milk companies. Cuneo was one of those men who loved children and carried a pocketful of sweets in the hopes of being able to pleasure one of his many grandchildren or the small offspring of his associates. He wore a round fedora with the brim turned down all the way round like a woman's sun hat, which broadened his already moon-shaped face into the very mask of joviality. He was one of the few Dons who had never been arrested and whose true activities had never even been suspected, so much so that he had served on civic committees and had been voted as Businessman of the Year for the state of New York. by the Chamber of Commerce. The closest ally to the Tattaglia family was Don Emilio Barzini. He had some of the gambling in Brooklyn and some in Queens. He had some prostitution, he had strong arm, he completely controlled Staten Island. He had some of the sports betting in the Bronx and Westchester. He was in narcotics. He had close ties to Cleveland and the West Coast, and he was one of the few men shrewd enough to be interested in Las Vegas and Reno, the open cities of Nevada. He also had interests in Miami Beach and Cuba. After the Corleone family, his was perhaps the strongest in New York, and therefore in the country. His influence reached even to Sicily. His hand was in every unlawful pie. He was even rumored to have a toehold in Wall Street. He had supported the Tattaglia family with money and influence since the start of the war. It was his ambition to supplant Don Corleone as the most powerful and respected mafia leader in the country and to take over part of the Corleone empire. He was a man much like Don Corleone, but more modern, more sophisticated, more businesslike. He could never be called an old mustache Pete, and he had the confidence of the newer, younger, brasher leaders on their way up. He was a man of great personal force, in a cold way, with none of Don Corleone's warmth, and he was perhaps at this moment the most respected man in the group. The last to arrive was Don Philip Tattaglia, the head of the Tattaglia family that had directly challenged the Corleone power by supporting Sollozzo, and had so nearly succeeded. And yet, curiously enough, he was held in a slight contempt by the others. For one thing, it was known that he had allowed himself to be dominated by Sollozzo, had in fact been led by the nose by that fine Turkish hand. He was held responsible for all this commotion, this uproar, that had so affected the conduct of everyday business by the New York families. Also, he was a 60-year-old dandy and woman chaser, and he had ample opportunity to indulge his weaknesses. For the Tattaglia family dealt in women. Its main business was prostitution. It also controlled most of the nightclubs in the United States and could place any talent anywhere in the country. Philip Tattaglia was not above using strong arm to get control of promising singers and comics and muscling in on record firms. But prostitution was the main source of the family income. His personality was unpleasant to these men. He was a whiner, always complaining of the costs in his family business. Laundry bills, all those towels ate up the profits, but he owned the laundry firm that did the work. The girls were lazy and unstable, running off, committing suicide. The pimps were treacherous and dishonest and without a shred of loyalty. Good help was hard to find. Young lads of Sicilian blood turned up their noses at such work, considered it beneath their honor to traffic and abuse women. Those rascals who would slit a throat with a song in their lips and the cross of an Easter palm in the lapel of their jackets. So, Philip Tattaglia would rant on to audiences unsympathetic and contemptuous. His biggest howl was reserved for authorities who had it in their power to issue and cancel liquor licenses for his nightclubs and cabarets. He swore he had made more millionaires than Wall Street with the money he had paid those thieving guardians of official seals. In a curious way, his almost victorious war against the Corleone family had not won him the respect it deserved. They knew his strength had come first from Sollozzo and then from the Barzini family. Also, the fact that with the advantage of surprise he had not won complete victory was evidence against him. If he had been more efficient, all this trouble could have been avoided. The death of Don Corleone would have meant the end of the war. It was proper, since they had both lost sons in their war against each other, that Don Corleone and Philip Tattaglia should acknowledge each other's presence only with a formal nod. Don Corleone was the object of attention, the other men studying him to see what mark of weakness had been left on him by his wounds and defeats. The puzzling factor was why Don Corleone had sued for peace after the death of his favorite son. It was an acknowledgment of defeat. It would almost surely lead to a lessening of his power. But they would soon know. There were greetings, there were drinks to be served, and almost another half hour went by before Don Corleone took his seat at the polished walnut table. Unobtrusively, Hagen sat in the chair slightly to the Don's left and behind him. This was the signal for the other Dons to make their way to the table. Their aides sat behind them, the consigliere up close, so that they could offer any advice when needed. Don Corleone was the first to speak, and he spoke as if nothing had happened, as if he had not been grievously wounded and his eldest son slain, his empire in a shambles, his personal family scattered, Freddie in the west and under the protection of the Molinari family, and Michael secreted in the wastelands of Sicily. He spoke, naturally, in Sicilian dialect.
I want to thank you all for coming. I consider it a service done to me personally, and I am in the debt of each and every one of you. And so, I will say at the beginning that I am here not to quarrel or convince, but only to reason, and, as a reasonable man, do everything possible for us all, to part friends here, too. I give my word on that, and some of you who know me well know that I do not give my word lightly. Ah, well, let's get down to business. We are all honorable men here. We don't have to give each other assurances as if we were lawyers.
He paused. None of the others spoke. Some were smoking cigars, others sipping their drinks. All of these men were good listeners, patient men. They had one other thing in common. They were those rarities, men who had refused to accept the rule of organized society, men who refused the dominion of other men. There was no force, no mortal man who could bend them to their will, unless they wished it. They were men who guarded their free will with wiles and murder. Their wills could be subverted only by death, or the utmost reasonableness. Don Corleone sighed.
How did things ever go so far? Well, no matter. A lot of foolishness has come to pass. It was so unfortunate, so unnecessary. But let me tell what happened as I see it.
He paused to see if someone would object to his telling his side of the story.
Thank God my health has been restored and maybe I can help set this affair aright. Perhaps my son was too rash, too headstrong. I don't say no to that. Anyway, let me just say that Sollazzo came to me with a business affair in which he asked me for my money and my influence. He said he had the interest of the Tartaglia family. The affair involved drugs, in which I have no interest. I'm a quiet man, and such endeavors are too lively for my taste. I explained this to Sollazzo. With all respect for him and the Tartaglia family, I gave him my no, with all courtesy. I told him his business would not interfere with mine, that I had no objection to his earning his living in this fashion. He took it ill, and brought misfortune down on all our heads. Well, that's life. Everyone here could tell his own tale of sorrow. That's not to my purpose.
Don Corleone paused and motioned to Hagen for a cold drink, which Hagen swiftly furnished him. Don Corleone wet his mouth.
I'm willing to make the peace. Tartaglia has lost a son. I have lost a son. We are quits. What would the world come to if people kept carrying grudges against all reason? That has been the cross of Sicily, where men are so busy with vendettas they have no time to earn bread for their families. It's foolishness. So, I say now, let things be as they were before. I have not taken any steps to learn who betrayed and killed my son. Given peace, I will not do so. I have a son who cannot come home, and I must receive assurances that when I arrange matters so that he can return safely, that there will be no interference, no danger from the authorities. Once that's settled, maybe we can talk about other matters that interest us and do ourselves, all of us, a profitable service today.
Corleone gestured expressively, submissively, with his hands.
That is all I want.
It was very well done. It was the Don Corleone of old, reasonable, pliant, soft-spoken. But every man there had noted that he had claimed good health, which meant he was a man not to be held cheaply despite the misfortunes of the Corleone family. It was noted that he had said the discussion of other business was useless until the peace he asked for was given. It was noted that he had asked for the old status quo, that he would lose nothing despite his having got the worst of it over the past year. However, it was Emilio Barzini who answered Don Corleone, not Tartaglia. He was curt and to the point without being rude or insulting.
That is all true enough. But there's a little more. Don Corleone is too modest. The fact is that Sollazzo and the Tartaglias could not go into their new business without the assistance of Don Corleone. In fact, his disapproval injured them. That's not his fault, of course. The fact remains that the judges and politicians who would accept the favors from Don Corleone, even on drugs, would not allow themselves to be influenced by anybody else when it came to narcotics. Sollazzo couldn't operate if he didn't have some insurance of his people being treated gently. We all know that. We would all be poor men otherwise. And now that they have increased the penalties, the judges and the prosecuting attorneys drive a hard bargain when one of our people get in trouble with the narcotics. Even a Sicilian sentenced to 20 years might break the omertà and talk his brains out. That can't happen. Don Corleone controls all that apparatus. His refusal to let us use it is not the act of a friend. He takes the bread out of the mouths of our families. Times have changed. It's not like the old days when everyone can go his own way. If Corleone has all the judges in New York, then he must share them, or let us others use them. Certainly he can present a bill for such services. We're not communists, after all, eh? But he has to let us draw water from the well. It's that simple.
When Barzini had finished talking, there was a silence. The lines were now drawn. There could be no return to the old status quo. What was more important was that Barzini, by speaking out, was saying that if peace was not made, he would openly join the Tattaglias in their war against the Corleone. And he had scored a telling point. Their lives and their fortunes depended upon their doing each other services. The denial of a favor asked by a friend was an act of aggression. Favors were not asked lightly, and so could not be lightly refused. Don Corleone finally spoke to answer.
My friends, I didn't refuse out of spite. You all know me. When have I ever refused an accommodation? That's simply not in my nature. But I had to refuse this time. Why? Because I think this drug business will destroy us in the years to come. There's too much strong feeling about such traffic in this country. It's not like whiskey or gambling or even women, which most people want and is forbidden them by the pezzi avanti of the church and the government. But drugs are dangerous for everyone connected with them. It could jeopardize all other business. And let me say, I am flattered by the belief that I am so powerful with the judges and law officials, and I wish it were true. I do have some influence, but many of the people who respect my counsel might lose this respect if drugs become involved in our relationship. They are afraid to be involved in such business, and they have strong feelings about it. Even policemen who help us in gambling and other things will refuse to help us in drugs. So, to ask me to perform a service in these matters is to ask me to do a disservice to myself. But I'm willing to do even that, if all of you think it proper in order to adjust other matters.
When Don Corleone had finished speaking, the room became much more relaxed, with more whisperings and crosstalk. He had conceded the important point. He would offer his protection to any organized business venture in drugs. He was, in effect, agreeing almost entirely to Sollazzo's original proposal if that proposal was endorsed by the national group gathered here. It was understood that he would never participate in the operational phase, nor would he invest his money. He would merely use his protective influence with the legal apparatus. But this was a formidable concession. The Don of Los Angeles, Frank Falcone, spoke to answer.
There's no way of stopping our people from going into that business. They go in on their own, and they get in trouble. There's too much money in it to resist. So it's more dangerous if we don't go in. At least if we control it, we can cover it better, organize it better, make sure it causes less trouble. Being in it is not so bad. There has to be control. There has to be protection. There has to be organization. We can't have everybody running around doing just what they please, like a bunch of anarchists.
The Don of Detroit, more friendly to Corleone than any of the others, also now spoke against his friend's position, in the interest of reasonableness.
I don't believe in drugs. For years I paid my people extra so they wouldn't do that kind of business. But it didn't matter. It didn't help. Somebody comes to them and says, I have powders. If you put up the $3,000-$4,000 investment, we can make $50,000 distributing. Who can resist such a profit? And they are so busy with their little side business, they neglect the work I pay them to do. There's more money in drugs. It's getting bigger all the time. There's no way to stop it, so we have to control the business and keep it respectable. I don't want any of it near schools. I don't want any of it sold to children. That is an infamita. In my city, I would try to keep the traffic in the dark people, the colored. They are the best customers, the least troublesome, and they are animals anyway. They have no respect for their wives or their families or for themselves. Let them lose their souls with drugs. But something has to be done. We just can't let people do as they please and make trouble for everyone.
This speech of the Detroit Don was received with loud murmurs of approval. He had hit the nail on the head. You couldn't even pay people to stay out of the drug traffic. As for his remarks about children, that was his well-known sensibility, his tender-heartedness speaking. After all, who would sell drugs to children? Where would children get the money? As for his remarks about the coloreds, that was not even heard. The Negroes were considered of absolutely no account, of no force whatsoever. That they had allowed society to grind them into the dust proved them of no account, and his mentioning them in any way proved that the Don of Detroit had a mind that always wavered toward irrelevancies. All the Dons spoke. All of them deplored the traffic in drugs as a bad thing that would cause trouble, but agreed there was no way to control it. There was simply too much money to be made in the business. Therefore, it followed that there would be men who would dare anything to dabble in it. That was human nature. It was finally agreed. Drug traffic would be permitted, and Don Corleone must give it some legal protection in the East. It was understood that the Barzini and Tattaglia families would do most of the large-scale operations. With this out of the way, the conference was able to move on to other matters of a wider interest. There were many complex problems to be solved. It was agreed that Las Vegas and Miami were to be open cities where any of the families could operate. They all recognized that these were the cities of the future. It was also agreed that no violence would be permitted in these cities and that petty criminals of all types were to be discouraged. It was agreed that in momentous affairs, in executions that were necessary but might cause too much of a public outcry, the execution must be approved by this council. It was agreed that button men and other soldiers were to be restrained from violent crimes and acts of vengeance against each other on personal matters. It was agreed that families would do each other services when requested, such as providing executioners technical assistance in pursuing certain courses of action, such as bribing jurors, which in some instances could be vital. These discussions, informal, colloquial, and on a high level, took time and were broken by lunch and drinks from the buffet bar. Finally, Don Barzini sought to bring the meeting to an end.
That's the whole matter, then. We have the peace, and let me pay my respects to Don Corleone, whom we have all known over the years as a man of his word. If there are any more differences, we can meet again. We need not become foolish again. On my part, the road is new and fresh. I'm glad this is all settled.
Only Philip Tattaglia was a little worried still. The murder of Santino Corleone made him the most vulnerable person in this group if war broke out again. He spoke at length for the first time.
I've agreed to everything here. I'm willing to forget my own misfortune. But I would like to hear some strict assurances from Corleone. Will he attempt any individual vengeance? When time goes by, and his position perhaps becomes stronger, will he forget that we have sworn our friendship? How am I to know that in 3 or 4 years he won't feel that he's been ill-served, forced against his will to this agreement, and so free to break it? Will we have to guard against each other all the time, or can we truly go in peace with peace of mind? Would Corleone give us all his assurances, as I now give mine?
It was then that Don Corleone gave the speech that would be long remembered, and that reaffirmed his position as the most far-seeing statesman among them. So full of common sense, so direct from the heart, and to the heart of the matter. In it, he coined a phrase that was to become as famous, in its way, as Churchill's Iron Curtain, though not public knowledge until more than 10 years later. For the first time, he stood up to address the council. He was short and a little thin from his illness. Perhaps his 60 years showed a bit more, but there was no question that he had regained all his former strength and had all his wits.
What manner of men are we, then, if we do not have our reason? We are all no better than beasts in a jungle, if that were the case. But we have reason. We can reason with each other, and we can reason with ourselves. To what purpose would I start all these troubles again, the violence and the turmoil? My son is dead, and that is a misfortune, and I must bear it, not make the innocent world around me suffer with me. And so I say, I give my honor, that I will never seek vengeance. I will never seek knowledge of the deeds that have been done in the past. I will leave here with a pure heart. Let me say that we must always look to our interests. We are all men who have refused to be fools, who have refused to be puppets dancing on a string, pulled by the men on high. We have been fortunate here in this country. Already most of our children have found a better life. Some of you have sons who are professors, scientists, musicians. And you are fortunate. Perhaps your grandchildren will become the new Pessinovanti. None of us here want to see our children following our footsteps. It's too hard a life. They can be as others, their position and security won by our courage. I have grandchildren now, and I hope their children may someday, who knows, be a governor, a president. Nothing's impossible here in America. But we have to progress with the times. The time is past for guns and killings and massacres. We have to be cunning, like the business people. There's more money in it, and it's better for our children and our grandchildren. As for our own deeds, we are not responsible for the 90 calibers, the Pessinovantis who take it upon themselves to decide what we shall do with our lives, who declare wars they wish us to fight in to protect what they own. Who is to say we should obey the laws they make for their own interest and to our hurt? And who are they, then, to meddle when we look after our own interests? Sono cosa nostra. These are our own affairs. We will manage our world for ourselves because it is our world, cosa nostra. And so, we have to stick together to guard against outside meddlers. Otherwise, they will put the ring in our nose, as they have put the ring in the nose of all the millions of Neapolitans and other Italians in this country. For this reason, I forego my vengeance for my dead son. For the common good, I swear, now that as long as I am responsible for the actions of my family, there will not be one finger lifted against any man here without just cause and utmost provocation. I am willing to sacrifice my commercial interests for the common good. This is my word. This is my honor. And there are those of you here who know I have never betrayed either. But I have a selfish interest. My youngest son had to flee, accused of Salazzo's murder and that of a police captain. I must now make arrangements so that he can come home with safety, cleared of all these false charges. That is my affair, and I will make those arrangements. I must find the real culprits, perhaps, or perhaps I must convince the authorities of his innocence. Perhaps the witnesses and informants will recant their lies. But again, I say, this is my affair, and I believe I will be able to bring my son home. But let me say this. I am a superstitious man, a ridiculous failing, but I must confess it here. And so if some unlucky accident should befall my youngest son, if some police officer should accidentally shoot him, if he should hang himself in his cell, if new witnesses appear to testify to his guilt, my superstition will make me feel that it was the result of the ill will still borne me by some people here. Let me go further. If my son is struck by a bolt of lightning, I will blame some of the people here. If his plane should fall into the sea, or his ship sink beneath the waves of the ocean, if he should catch a mortal fever, if his automobile should be struck by a train, such is my superstition that I would blame the ill will felt by people here. Gentlemen, that ill will, that bad luck, I could never forgive. But aside from that, let me swear by the souls of my grandchildren that I will never break the peace we have made. After all, are we or are we not better men than those Pessinovanti who have killed countless millions of men in our lifetime?
With this, Don Corleone stepped from his place and went down the table to where Don Philip Tartaglia was sitting. Tartaglia rose to greet him, and the two men embraced, kissing each other's cheeks. The other dons in the room applauded and rose to shake hands with everybody in sight and to congratulate Don Corleone and Don Tartaglia on their new friendship. It was not perhaps the warmest friendship in the world. They would not send each other Christmas gift greetings, but they would not murder each other. That was friendship enough in this world, all that was needed. Since his son Freddie was under the protection of the Molinari family in the West, Don Corleone lingered with the San Francisco Don after the meeting to thank him. Molinari said enough for Don Corleone to gather that Freddie had found his niche out there, was happy, and had become something of a ladies' man. He had a genius for running a hotel, it seemed. Don Corleone shook his head in wonder, as many fathers do when told of undreamed-of talents in their children. Wasn't it true that sometimes the greatest misfortunes brought unforeseen rewards? They both agreed that this was so. Meanwhile, Corleone made it clear to the San Francisco Don that he was in his debt for the great service done in protecting Freddie. He let it be known that his influence would be exerted so that the important racing wires would always be available to his people, no matter what changes occurred in the power structure in the years to come. An important guarantee, since the struggle over this facility was a constant open wound, complicated by the fact that the Chicago people had their heavy hand in it. But Don Corleone was not without influence even in the land of barbarians, and so his promise was a gift of gold. It was evening before Don Corleone, Tom Hagen, and the bodyguard chauffeur, who happened to be Rocco Lampone, arrived at the mall in Long Beach. When they went into the house, the Don said to Hagen,
"Our driver, that man Lampone, keep an eye on him. He's a fellow worth something better, I think."
Hagen wondered at this remark. Lampone had not said a word all day, had not even glanced at the two men in the back seat. He had opened the door for the Don. The car had been in front of the bank when they emerged. He had done everything correctly, but no more than any well-trained chauffeur might do. Evidently, the Don's eye had seen something he had not seen. The Don dismissed Hagen and told him to come back to the house after supper, but to take his time and rest a little, since they would put in a long night of discussion. He also told Hagen to have Clemenza and Tessio present. They should come at 10 p.m., not before. Hagen was to brief Clemenza and Tessio on what had happened at the meeting that afternoon. At 10, the Don was waiting for the three men in his office, the corner room of the house with its law library and special phone. There was a tray with whiskey bottles, ice, and soda water. The Don gave his instructions.
"We made the peace this afternoon. I gave my word and my honor, and that should be enough for all of you. But our friends are not so trustworthy, so let's all be on our guard still. We don't want any more nasty little surprises."
The Don turned to Hagen.
"You've let the Bochicchio hostages go?"
Hagen nodded.
"I called Clemenza as soon as I got home."
Corleone turned to the massive Clemenza. The Capo Regime nodded.
"I released them. Tell me, Godfather, is it possible for Sicilian to be as dumb as the Bochicchios pretend to be?"
Don Corleone smiled a little.
"They are clever enough to make a good living. Why is it so necessary to be more clever than that? It's not the Bochicchios who cause the troubles of this world, but it's true. They haven't got the Sicilian head."
They were all in a relaxed mood now that the war was over. Don Corleone himself mixed drinks and brought one to each man. The Don sipped his carefully and lit up a cigar.
"I want nothing set forth to discover what happened to Sonny. That's done with, and to be forgotten. I want all cooperation with the other families, even if they become a little greedy and we don't get our proper share in things. I want nothing to break this peace no matter what the provocation, until we found a way to bring Michael home. And I want that to be first thing on your minds. Remember this. When he comes back, he must come back in absolute safety. I don't mean from the Tartaglias or the Barzinis. What I'm concerned about are the police. Sure, we can get rid of the real evidence against him. That waiter won't testify, nor that spectator or gunman or whatever he was. The real evidence is the least of our worries since we know about it. What we have to worry about is the police framing false evidence because their informers have assured them that Michael Corleone is the man who killed their captain. Very well. We have to demand that the 5 families do everything in their power to correct this belief of the police. All their informers who work with the police must come up with new stories. I think after my speech this afternoon, they will understand it is to their interest to do so. But that's not enough. We have to come up with something special, so Michael won't ever have to worry about that again. Otherwise, there's no point in him coming back to this country. So, let's all think about that. That's the most important matter. Now, any man should be allowed one foolishness in his life. I have had mine. I want all the land around the mall bought, the houses bought. I don't want any man able to look out his window into my garden even if it's a mile away. I want a fence around the mall, and I want the mall to be on full protection all the time. I want a gate in that fence. In short, I wish now to live in a fortress. Let me say to you now that I will never go into the city to work again. I will be semi-retired. I feel an urge to work in the garden, to make a little wine when the grapes are in season. I want to live in my house. The only time I leave is to go on a little vacation or to see someone on important business, and then I want all precautions taken. Now, don't take this amiss. I'm not preparing anything. I'm being prudent. I've always been a prudent man. There's nothing I find so little to my taste as carelessness in life. Women and children can afford to be careless. Men cannot. Be leisurely. In all these things, no frantic preparations to alarm our friends. It can be done in such a way as to seem natural. Now, I'm going to leave things more and more up to each of you three. I want the Santino regime disbanded and the men placed in your regimes. And that should reassure our friends and show that I mean peace. Tom, I want you to put together a group of men who will go to Las Vegas and give me a full report on what is going on out there. Tell me about Fredo, what's really happening out there. I hear I wouldn't recognize my own son. It seems he's a cook now, that he amuses himself with young girls more than a grown man should. Well, he was always too serious when he was young, and he was never the man for family business. But let's find out what really can be done out there.
Hagen said quietly,
"Should we send your son-in-law? After all, Carlo is a native of Nevada. He knows his way around."
Don Corleone shook his head.
No. My wife is lonely here without any of her children. I want Constanzia and her husband moved into one of the houses on the mall. I want Carlo given a responsible job. Maybe I've been too harsh on him, and...
Don Corleone made a grimace.
I'm short of sons. Take him out of the gambling and put him in with the unions where he can do some paperwork and a lot of talking. He's a good talker.
There was the tiniest note of contempt in the Don's voice. Hagen nodded.
Okay, Clemenza and I will go over all the people and put together a group to do the Vegas job. Do you want me to call Freddie home for a few days?
The Don shook his head.
What for? My wife can still cook our meals. Let him stay out there.
The three men shifted uneasily in their seats. They had not realized Freddie was in such severe disfavor with his father, and they suspected it must be because of something they did not know. Don Corleone sighed.
I hope to grow some good green peppers and tomatoes in the garden this year. More than we can eat. I'll make you presents of them. I want a little peace, a little quiet and tranquility for my old age. Well, that's all. Have another drink if you like.
It was a dismissal. The men rose. Hagen accompanied Clemenza and Tessio to their cars and arranged meetings with them to thrash out the operational details that would accomplish the stated desires of their Don. Then he went back into the house, where he knew Don Corleone would be waiting for him.